Okay, I think this is recording. I'm gonna close all this random stuff that's open. Okay, so we are here to talk about plants. We used to do a whole unit on plants, and I forgot that I kind of like plants. I know that makes me a little bit of a nerd, but I just love everything biology, to be honest. And so I kind of hate that we don't do the whole unit on plants anymore, but we do talk a little bit about them in photosynthesis, so we talk a little bit there, and we do talk a little bit about water potential in plants and turgor pressure and all that in unit 2, I think it is, and then we talk about some more here. So I guess we kind of do a pretty fair deal for plants. So the first one says, I can describe the levels of organization in plants. Well, plants are little creatures like you and me, and they have the same levels of organization that we do. So they have cells that make up tissues. Those tissues make up organs. Those organs make up organ systems, which we don't really think about that in plants, but we'll talk about it in just a second. And then those organ systems make up the whole organism, which is the plant, which might be a rose bush or a carrot bush or a pine tree or an apple tree or whatever, okay? So that's the levels of organization. And each one is built on the other. So tissues are made of cells, organs made of tissues. All right, so there's a bunch of different types of cells. My favorites, we didn't really talk about, but the ones that you need to know probably are xylem, phloem, and mesophyll. So mesophyll are your photosynthesizers. Phloem move your food, and xylem moves your water. So that's really important to plants. But my favorites are parenchyma, collenchyma, and sclerenchyma. And so I'll give you one just so you can see how the chyma is spelled. So it looks like chyma. It actually looks more like chyma. So if you want to Google that and look up parenchyma and sclerenchyma, I don't know, it's just interesting. But so they're just fun to say. I think that's why I like them. Tissues, you've got really 3. You've got your dermal tissue. You've got your vascular tissue. So if you think about what your vascular system does for you, like your cardiovascular system, that's your arteries and veins. It's the same thing that's going to be your xylem and phloem that move your fluid and sap through the plant. And then we have ground tissue. So basically, if it's not dermal or skin, if it's not vascular or moving, transporting things around the cell, then everything else is ground tissue. The organs, main organs are roots, leaves, stems, I believe is the other one. And then I don't think I included this, but also flowers, because not all plants have flowers, so I didn't include it, but flowers would be another organ. Your organ systems, there's really 2. There's the shoot system, and that is basically everything above ground. So that's going to be your leaves, your stems, and your flowers, if it has flowers, and then your root system, which is going to also incorporate stem, because there are some stems underground, but then your roots coming off of that. And then the whole organism, of course, is the whole little precious little plant there, okay? So I can describe how each level of organization contributes to the survival of a plant. The beauty of compartmentalization means breaking and something down into compartments or to pieces, is that each part has a separate job. And what that does is that allows it to be more efficient. We talked about this way long ago. I don't remember what unit it was, maybe unit 2. We talked about how compartmentalization increases efficiency. So by breaking it down to plant, these cells, all they do is move water. These cells, all they do is move food or sap or sugar or whatever you want to call it. These cells are primarily doing photosynthesis. By breaking those jobs up, you're allowing this one to be really good at moving water, and this one to be really good at moving sugar and other things around the plant. And so they can get really good at their job, and that way they can increase efficiency. They can figure out a way to do it the most efficient way and save energy for the whole organism. So each of these have specific jobs. The dermal is to protect and to cover the plant, to prevent 2 things really: infection, because plants do get sick, and also to prevent desiccation, which is a fancy word for drying out. So it helps the plant keep water. Vascular is going to be transport, and then ground is going to be doing photosynthesis. It's also where you're going to store things. Support, so like the parts of your plant, they're supporting the parts above it. All of that's going to be ground. Roots, their main job is to anchor the plant and absorb nutrients and water. Leaves are doing primarily photosynthesis. Stems are primarily for transport and support. And then flowers are going to be for reproduction. for those plants that have flowers. And then when you look at the shoot system, this is primarily producing food for the plant. This is primarily getting water and nutrients and storing some of that food for later. So each of these has jobs that are crucial to survival for the plant and to reproduction, which is the survival of the species. And because they're broken down into each, each having different jobs, they can be really good and really efficient at those jobs. I can explain the ways in which molecules and or compounds are transported throughout a plant. All right, because I could draw this, but it wouldn't be very good drawing, I'm going to defer to the PowerPoint for this one. So there are really two main categories of things that we're moving through a plant. The first is water. And water is going to be moved up a plant, so against gravity, through something called transpirational pull. Okay, and so when you think about movement, if you think about moving something, let's say you have a brick that's kind of heavy in your house or in your yard, not in your house, in your yard that needs to be moved, or a rock. You kind of have two options. You can push it, or you can tie something around it and pull it, or put it in a wagon or something and pull it. And so when you think about that, that's what we're doing here. With water, we are pulling the water up the plant. Okay, so what's driving that? What's actually pulling that water? Well, transpiration is what's pulling it. Transpiration is the evaporation of water from the leaves, from the stomata, when those stomata open to do gas exchange. So the stomata open, they're doing that so that they can get CO2 and get rid of oxygen. And when that happens, some water escapes. And so when that water escapes, let me see if I can present this and make it a little bit bigger so you can see it a little bit better. What's happening up here is you're seeing the stomata are open, the water is coming out through evaporation, and what happens is when this little water molecule leaves, this next one's going to move into its spot. Well, when that one moves here, the next one moves into its spot, and when that one moves there, the next one moves into its spot, because they're actually attached to each other through hydrogen bonds, which we call cohesion. And so it's kind of like a single file line. You can imagine if you're holding hands with a bunch of people in a line, if I pull the first person, it's going to pull the whole line. So the second person is now going to be standing where the first person was before I pulled them. And the third person is going to move up to where the second person was, because they're all kind of holding on to each other. And so as this water evaporates and breaks free and turns to a gas, it breaks free from the other water molecules and moves away. All of the water molecules behind it are going to move up one position. So that's going to pull those from these veins out into the spongy mesophyll. The ones that are in the veins are going to pull the ones that are in the branches and the trunk. And as those get pulled up, they're going to pull more up from the roots. And as the ones in the roots get pulled in and up, then more is going to get pulled in from the soil. Well, how does this happen? Well, cohesion is part of the reason. But you may remember that hydrogen bonding is a really weak bond. So if I pull too hard on this water, this bond's just going to break. The other force that's driving the water up is the change in water potential. If you'll remember, when we talked about water potential, water always moves towards the lower or more negative water potential. And it just so happens that as you go up a tree and out into the air, it gets more and more negative. So when we look down here at the soil, well, it's hiding it now. Say it says soil is negative 0.3 megapascals, and the trunk xylem, so in the trunk in here, in the roots, it's going to be negative 0.6. And so that is going to naturally move to the negative 0.6 because that's more negative than the negative 0.3. Then further up the tree, they measured the water potential, and it was negative 0.8. Well, that means the water is going to move from the negative 0.6 towards that 0.8 because it's a negative water potential. Then the leaves, they have in the cells, in the cell walls, they have a negative 1 megapascals. And in the air spaces, so these pockets out here, it has negative 7. So we're starting to see bigger jumps. Well, look what happens when you talk about the inside the leaf versus outside. Inside the leaf is negative 7, outside is negative 100. So this water is just jumping. It is antsy to get to the more negative water potential from where it's at. And so that's also going to be pulling that water up and up and up. So cohesion, the attachment of one water to the next one, as well as this change in water potential, is going to allow transpiration to literally pull water from the roots all the way up. Even those massive redwoods out in California pulls water all the way up to the very tip top, if that's where that leaf is at. And so that's the way that water moves, is by pulling. It's passive. It doesn't require any energy from the plant. And so the xylem cells are actually dead. A xylem cell is formed and then it dies. And so all that cytoplasm and everything dies and decomposes. And so basically you just have a straw. I mean, the cell just becomes like an empty straw, and that gives plenty of room for that water to move up. All right, the other type of movement within plants is movement of the sap, which is just the sugar that's produced by the sugar or glucose that's produced by photosynthesis, that is produced in the leaves during photosynthesis during the spring and summer. And so what we see happening down here is we see, this would be during the spring or summer, our leaf is producing glucose, which binds with another glucose to make sucrose at amazing rates. I mean, think about all the leaves on a tree. Every one of those leaves is just cranking out photosynthesis to make that glucose. So you're going to see lots of sugar produced. It's going to be mixed with a little bit of water to make sap, and then it's going to be moved down the tree to the roots to be stored. And so in the spring, the leaves, in summer, the leaves are the sources of the sugar because that's where they're being produced, and they're being sent down to the roots, which is the sink. So a sink is anything that stores or gets rid of something. So in this case, it's storing it. It's storing that sugar. Now you would think, oh, well, gravity will do this. It'll be passive. It doesn't need anything. It's not that easy. Sap is pretty viscous. It's pretty thick. It is also going to be moving through the phloem, which are living cells. So it's not moving through an empty space like the xylem. If it was, it probably could just like slurp on down. But because the phloem are alive, it's got to move through those cells. And so that is going to slow it way down. And so to speed things up, we do use some ATP. We do use some active transport to push. Remember I said when you're moving something, you can either push or pull. We're going to push that sugar down to the sink. Okay. We also are going to see other things moving in that. With the sap, we can see hormones. Plants use hormones to talk to other parts of their body. And so we can see that being moved as well down through this, through these plant cells. Now they are moving through plasmodesmata, so it doesn't have to cross the cell wall. It's going to move through the pores in the cell wall. But it does, like I said, it does take some active transport because it's slow going. And so to speed it up, we add a little ATP to get things going. I will say this, in the winter, or in the late winter, early spring, so March, April, when the plants are all starting to bud and kind of wake up from the winter, these are going to switch places. The source is now going to become the roots because that's where the sugar's at. And they're going to send that sugar up, which obviously is going to take energy, to the buds on the plant so that it can grow at those sites of growth. So to bud out plant leaves and flowers and all that. So in the late winter, early spring, when all that budding is happening, the roots are then going to become the source, and those buds up here at the top of the tree are going to become the sink because they're where that sugar is going to be gone to be used. It's going to be draining that sugar out of the plant and burning it off through respiration, cellular respiration, glycolysis, Krebs cycle, all that good stuff, to make ATP so that plant can grow. So we talk about the movement of sugar or food in the plant is positive pressure. So it is moved by an active process. It is moved what we call bulk flow. So bulk means a lot. So we're moving a lot of it at a time. And it is always going to go from source to sink, but the source and the sink change depending on the time of year. So that is, I can explain the ways in which molecules and or compounds are transported throughout a plant. I can explain the role of cell signaling in the survival of a plant. Well, I just mentioned hormones, and plants do use hormones. They also use local regulators. They also use direct contact to do cell signaling so that parts of the plant can communicate with other parts, and that's going to allow that plant to survive. It's going to allow it to reproduce. It's going to allow it to respond to invaders like pathogens, because plants, like I said, they do get sick. It's going to allow it to respond to things like heat and cold and drought and too much water. So it is responding to the environment. It's doing that through cell signaling. So it receives those signals get transduced into some sort of response. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. It says, I can explain how plants respond to various stressors to ensure survival. So being able to respond to the environment is one thing that's going to allow us to survive, and us includes all living things. So I'm talking about us as in animals, plants, fungus, everything. So some different stressors that plants might see. One of the biggest stressors is going to be heat and drought. So hot, dry conditions, we've talked about that with the C4 and CAM plants. What plants cannot afford to do is they cannot afford to dehydrate. If they dehydrate, they can't do photosynthesis, because if you'll remember, Water is one of the first molecules in the light reaction. It's split, and that's where we get our electrons that we eventually use to make NADPH, which we take over to the dark reaction to make the glucose. So if you don't have water, you can't do the light reactions, or you can't do that linear flow and get your NADPH and your ATP to go to make glucose. You can do that cyclic flow, but remember that doesn't make glucose. So plants want to avoid dehydrating at all costs. So in a drought, they're going to do a couple of things. They're going to release the hormone abscisic acid, or ABA, and that is going to tell the plant to slow down growth, because, hey, if I'm about to die from dehydration, it doesn't really matter if I get bigger. So I'm going to slow down growth. It's going to close the stomata. That's going to be the number one thing, and the first thing it does is close all those stomata so that water can't escape through transpiration. And then it's also going to roll the leaves, or cause the leaves to try to decrease their surface area, and that's going to decrease evaporation as well. It will also tell the plant to grow its roots. So it's going to slow growth of the majority of the plant, but it is going to tell the roots to grow so that they can go deeper and try to find water. So that's how it's going to respond to drought. Now, what if it has too much water? You think about plants that live near the ocean. What if there's a hurricane and that water comes on land? What are those plants going to do? Well, they do have a response to that. They get the signal that there's not enough water. They go through transduction, and the response is to release a hormone called ethylene. Ethylene is going to travel through their bodies down to their roots, and it's going to cause apoptosis in the root cells to create some air pockets, because we don't really think about roots needing air, because we think, oh, they're absorbing water and minerals, but they're also doing respiration. And for respiration, you need oxygen. And so they've got to have some oxygen. If they get waterlogged, the plant can die. And so this is a normal root, and this is a root that has been exposed to flooding. And so you can see it's done some apoptosis, gotten rid of some cells, and that's created some air pockets to allow the plant to survive. Okay, another thing is salt. What if they have too much salt? Well, wherever salt goes, water goes. So if there's a lot of salt outside the plant, water's going to leave the plant and go to that salt, and the plant's going to dehydrate. So one thing they do is they change their cell membrane so they don't bring a lot of salt on board, because they also don't want to get too much salt on board. Just like us, if you have too much salt in your body, that can create problems. Plants are the same way. If you get too much salt, that can create problems. Another thing they might do, and this is really kind of smart, not that they're doing it, they don't have brains, they're not thinking through this, but they are going to produce more solutes in their cells. So think back to chemistry, and think back to what we talked about with water potential. You know, if you have a membrane, and on this side you have a 1.0 molar solution, and on this side you have a 0.5 molar, water's going to move to that 1.0 molar solution. It has more salt. The water's going to move there. So if they can increase the concentration inside their cells to compete with the concentration outside, then not as much water will leave, and they won't dehydrate. So they will actually increase their solute potential, or their solute concentration, to decrease their water potential. Remember, water moves towards the more negative, and that way not as much water will leave, or maybe no water will leave. If they can get it to match the external environment, so they're isotonic, then no water will leave. All right, what about heat and cold? Well, if plants get too hot, they do have one option. They can sweat, so to speak. That's not the best way to, I'm using the term sweat because that's how we know it, but it's called evaporative cooling. They can use the evaporation of water to remove heat from their bodies. They're going to have to do this through transpiration, so they do have to think about dehydration. So this is only if they have plenty of water. It's not a drought, it's just hot. Like maybe it's, you know, where we have those thunderstorms in the summer, so it's hot, but it's also really humid. Then they don't have to worry about losing a bunch of water. Then they might do this to try to cool themselves off, just like we would sweat. Another thing they might do is they produce these heat shock proteins, and these heat shock proteins are going to basically come around other proteins and keep them from denaturing, because a lot of proteins denature in heat. So if this is a plant that lives in the desert where it gets 120, 130 degrees or even higher, then those proteins in their bodies may denature, but these other heat shock proteins come in and they basically kind of clamp around the proteins and prevent them from unfolding or denaturing. Cold, the opposite's problem. When it's really cold, what do? Well, they can increase their cytoplasmic solutes, because that will decrease the freezing point. That's definitely something you talked about in chemistry, colligative properties. Does that sound familiar? I think I'm pulling that from way back here, but I think that's the term that we talk about for changing freezing and boiling points. So they can do that. They can increase their concentration to decrease their freezing point. They can actually produce antifreeze proteins that will actually go in and prevent water. It'll decrease the freezing point as well and prevent proteins from having problems when they get too cold. And then we've talked about this before. Some of them will actually change the composition of their membrane to increase their unsaturated fatty acids. Remember, saturated fatty acids are straight, so they can pack really tightly together. And when things freeze, they get closer together. And so that makes the cell more likely to fracture. But if they can put in, let me get this away from my head. If they can put in unsaturated, which are bent, then they can't get as close together. That's going to create some space in the membrane and make it a little more flexible, a little more fluid, so to speak. And that's going to decrease its chance of fracturing when it freezes. All right, what if something's eating it? What if a sheep is coming in and it is eating the grass and the grass is saying, no, don't eat me? It does actually have some things that it can do to try to decrease things from eating it. One thing that plants do is they create structures like thorns. Goats don't care. Goats will eat thorns. I don't know what is in a goat's mouth that they can eat thorns and metal and all kind of weird stuff. But for most organisms, if they come upon a plant like a rose bush and it's covered in thorns, they're not going to eat it because those thorns are going to hurt, just like it hurts your fingers. Imagine getting a thorn in your mouth. Ow. No, thank you. Other things, they produce chemicals like garlic and mint. Jokes on them. We like garlic. We like mint. But those were chemicals that were created to make organisms not want to eat them. Bitter chemicals are another. Bitter tends to mean poison. And so once plants kind of figured that out, and I say figured that out, it was unintentional. Evolution is always unintentional. It's random. But plants that produced bitter compounds were not eaten because other organisms thought they were poisonous. And so because those bitter compounds made things think they were poisonous and they didn't get eaten, that got passed down. Another thing, and I think this is so cool, and it doesn't happen often, but I had to include it because it's so cool, is there is one plant that I know of, one particular plant, that can produce a chemical, a pheromone that sends out into the air when it's being eaten. And so when it's being chomped upon by this little grasshopper dude, caterpillar, whatever it is, it sends out this pheromone, this help signal into the air. Remember, a pheromone is a hormone that is speaking to a different organism. Hormones are speaking from one part of your body to another. Pheromones are chemicals that are speaking from you to another organism. So they're sending these out in the air. That recruits this wasp. This wasp says, that's a chemical I need to respond to. And so the wasp flies over. It lands on this caterpillar. It deposits its eggs inside the caterpillar. Those eggs hatch, and then they start eating the caterpillar from the inside out, which is disgusting, but that is what happens. And so it doesn't kill the caterpillar right away, so the plant is going to get eaten, but the plant says, hey, you know what, it's worth it to get eaten a little bit more if I can kill the caterpillar so he doesn't eat my whole body. And so those baby wasps eat up the caterpillar, kill the caterpillar, and then the caterpillar's not eating the plant anymore. So it's kind of a mutualistic relationship between the wasp and the leaf, and a predatory relationship between the wasp and the caterpillar, and an herbivory relationship between the caterpillar and the leaf. So anyway, it's kind of complicated, but it's kind of cool. And then the last thing is what happens when plants get sick. Well, the first line of defense, their innate immune system, like yours, is skin. If we can keep it out, we can keep it from infecting us. And so that's the first thing they have, is their skin, their epidermis. If that doesn't work, if they have a break in their skin or somehow the pathogen gets past it, then they have a couple of other things that they can do. They can, and this depends on the host, which is the plant that's being sick. They do not have a specific pathogen response. So they don't have an adaptive immune response like we do, where we learn our pathogens and have memory. They don't have all that, but they do have some different things that they do depending on the different species. Is it in here? Yes, here we go. The hypersensitive response. And this is hypersensitive. It's overly sensitive because what they're saying is, hey, so pretend this is a leaf. And right here's the infection. What they might do is they might kill this whole portion of the leaf to get rid of this little infection right here. So this part of the leaf is now gone. This part is still here. Is it overkill? Yeah. They're killing too much. They're being hypersensitive, but they want to ensure that they quarantine and kill that infection so that it doesn't kill the whole plant. So it's worth it to them to lose a bunch of leaf when they really only needed to kill a little bit, but they're going to kill more than a little bit to save the whole plant. Another is called a systemic acquired resistance. And this is where when one part of the plant gets infected, it sends a signal to the rest of the plant, and the whole plant starts producing defense genes. These are things like proteins that can punch holes in bacteria and things like that. Again, innate, not pathogen specific, but it's going to produce these defense genes throughout the whole plant. So as the infection were, if it were to spread, or as it spreads, those genes are already there. They're kind of already ready to go. It's kind of like preparing your army to fight before the fight is right here. So you've got this big army, but this little enemy, but as that enemy grows, because your army's already ready, then that can fight back that enemy. All right, so I can explain how plants respond to various stressors to ensure survival. There we go. I can explain the evolutionary advantages of angiosperms. So when we talk about plants, we have a couple of different groups of plants. We have mosses, which are short because they don't have any vascular tissue, so they have to be little. We have ferns, which don't have seeds, they just produce spores. Then we have gymnosperms, which means naked seed, and that's like your pine tree. So if you've ever seen a pine cone, it has these little helicopters that come out of it. Those are the seeds. They are naked. They're not in a fruit. And then we have angiosperms, which are the most advanced. They're the newest, evolutionarily speaking, but they are now the most common because they've outcompeted the majority of other plants because they are so successful. So 90% of plants are angiosperms, even though they're the newest plant on the scene. I mean, they've been around millions of years. I'm not like they're new, but they are newer than the others. And they have 3 unique features, and the F is red on purpose because we can all look at the F's there. They're the only ones that have flowers. Flowers attract organisms to fertilize them. They have fruits. So fruits, and I know this will disturb some of you, fruits can include things like cucumbers and squash and tomatoes. If it has a seed on the inside, it's a fruit, but also apples and bananas and all those kinds of things. And then they have something called double fertilization. And double fertilization is simply where, let's look at it here. It's just what it sounds like. 2 things are being fertilized. The egg is being fertilized, duh, that's what fertilization is, right? So that's the first fertilization, is the sperm fertilizes the egg. But the second thing that happens at the same time is a second sperm comes with that first sperm. They come in together, and the second sperm is going to fertilize a polar nuclei, or a polar cell that was produced in meiosis, and that is going to become the endosperm, or the baby food. Now, the benefit of this is we being angiosperms, I'm not an angiosperm, but I'm just saying these guys don't make baby food unless there's a baby. So that's the benefit of the double fertilization. If there's no first fertilization, if there's no sperm coming to get the egg, then there's no second sperm to get that baby food started. So they save energy by not making that endosperm, or that baby food, unless there is an embryo there, unless there is a fertilized egg. And so that's a huge advantage because it saves them a ton of energy. So those are the 3 evolutionary advantages. Flowers, and fruit. So flowers increase fertilization because they're attractive and they attract things. They also are structured such that fertilization is more likely to occur because the anthers are going to produce sperm that can blow either onto this stigma or onto another. The stigma is sticky, so the pollen will stick, and then they grow that pollen tube down here to the embryo and to that endosperm. So flowers, fruit, which has the seeds in it, it encourages things to eat it and disperse those seeds so that the babies can grow somewhere different than the mama. So for example, if a deer comes up to your apple tree and eats an apple, it's going to go somewhere else and poop that apple out later. Not the apple, but the, whatever. And the apple seeds will be in that poop. And so that baby plant, which is in that seed, will grow somewhere different than the mama plant. So it will decrease competition. So that's an advantage of fruit. And then of course the double fertilization. I can explain the ways in which plants use hormones. Plants use hormones to do all kinds of things. They use them to grow. So auxins and cytokinins, I saw those a minute ago. We kind of flew past them. They're used for growth. Gibberellins are also used for growth. We use them also for germination and fruit development. I'm not going to go over all the specifics here because you have done that in your e-packet. Abscisic acid, we've talked about it a minute ago. It's the only one to kind of slow things down. The rest of them are accelerating things. Ethylene is going to cause fruit to ripen. And they're also involved in that apoptosis pathway we mentioned earlier. And then your brassinosteroids are going to promote xylem growth and just increase growth in general. And so these are all hormones. That means they're produced in one part of the plant and they go to a different part of the plant where they're going to be a ligand. They're going to bind to a receptor and they're going to cause some kind of response. And so each of these has different responses. Phototropism and gravitropism, tropism is movement based on light. So this is when plants grow towards the light. And that's why you'll see if you have a plant near a window, it'll start growing towards the window. And a lot of times what we do is we'll spin it. And then after you spin it, it'll start growing again towards that light. That's phototropism. And then gravitropism is growing according to gravity. It's stems grow against gravity. That's why they grow up. And roots grow with gravity. That's why they grow down. And all that's controlled by auxin. I can explain ways in which plants use negative feedback loops to maintain homeostasis. So again, negative feedback loops are going to, the plant's at homeostasis. If it gets a little bit away, that negative feedback loops will bring it right back to homeostasis. And we talked about this with ABA. So when there is a drought, that's going to take the plant away from homeostasis. The plant is going to worry about dehydration. It's going to produce ABA. That's going to cause the plant to close the stomata, and then that's going to save the plant from dehydration. Once that abscisic acid is formed, it's going to cut off the pathway that produced it, because it doesn't want to keep producing abscisic acid, because hopefully it's going to rain soon. And so once that drought is over, we want to stop producing abscisic acid and we want to go back to normals. But the abscisic acid is going to help it during the drought. So it's negative feedback because the abscisic acid goes back and shuts down the pathway that produced the abscisic acid. Okay, and it brings the plant back to homeostasis. Positive feedback with ethylene. The apple ripens, it produces ethylene, it causes other apples to ripen, which produces more ethylene, which causes more apples to ripen, which produces more ethylene. You also see this with bananas and avocados, and that's why people say, oh, if you have avocados that aren't ripe, put them in a bag, close that bag up, or put it in a bag with some apples, close the bag up, and it will ripen faster. The same thing with bananas. You can put them in a bag and they'll ripen faster than they do on their own. You can do that at home as an experiment. You can put one banana in a bag and close it and put the other banana on the counter, have them side by side and see which one ripens faster. Once it's ripe, it stops producing ethylene because you've gotten your response, and so then you're back to homeostasis. So those are the ways that plants use positive and negative feedback loops. They do want to maintain homeostasis because they do need that for survival. And I think that's it for plants. So if you have questions, if you aren't sure about something, you just want me to explain it again, let me know and we will be happy to do that. Otherwise, that's all. I got to remember how to stop. All right, bye guys.